Clara Boone didn't wait for anyone to help her down from the stagecoach. She stepped off herself, both boots hitting the Wyoming dirt hard enough to raise a small cloud of dust, and she stood there, solid and still, while 6 ranch hands stared at her like she was some kind of error the hiring office had made. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, one of them, a boy no older than 17, started laughing. Not a quiet laugh. A loud, mean, carry-across-the-whole-yard laugh that pulled the others in one by one until the sound of it surrounded her like something designed to break a person. Clara didn't flinch. She picked up her canvas bag, lifted her chin exactly 1 inch, looked straight at the man standing apart from the rest, the one with the hollowed-out eyes and the unpaid debt expression carved into every line of his face, and said the only thing she planned to say for the next 10 minutes. "I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook." If you've ever felt like the room decided who you were before you opened your mouth, if you've ever walked into a place and felt the weight of every eye telling you that you didn't belong, then you already know exactly what Clara Boone was carrying when she stepped off that stagecoach. This is her story. And I promise you, if you stay until the end, it will stay with you a long time after. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss a story. And when you're done listening today, drop a comment and tell me what city or town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1883, and to a woman the world had already decided it didn't need. The letter had come on a Tuesday. Daniel Hayes read it 3 times, standing at the kitchen table, which had not had a clean surface in 4 months, and then he set it down and stared at the wall for a long while. The Cheyenne Labor and Domestic Placement Office had confirmed receipt of his application and informed him that a qualified housekeeper had been selected and would arrive by the Friday stage. The letter used words like capable and experienced and well-regarded, and Daniel had read those words and felt something loosen in his chest that had been knotted up since Margaret died, some small, cautious thing that might, if he wasn't careful, start to resemble hope. He'd told his foreman, Abe Crowder, on Wednesday morning, "Got someone coming Friday, housekeeper." Abe had looked up from the fence post he was setting and squinted against the sun. "Man or woman? Doesn't say. Doesn't matter long as they can keep that kitchen from killing somebody." Abe went back to the post. "Last 3 men you hired for housework quit inside a week. Place is in a state, Daniel. No offense." "Plenty taken," Daniel said and walked away. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't prepare the house. There wasn't much point, since the house had gotten past the kind of disorder that a day's cleaning could address. He didn't warn the ranch hands because ranch hands had a way of making things harder when you gave them information in advance. He just waited the way a man waits when he's learned that hope is a thing best held quietly and at a distance so it can't do too much damage when it fails. The Friday stage arrived 40 minutes late. Daniel was standing in the yard when it pulled in, and Abe was beside him, and behind them, in a loose, unhelpful cluster, were 5 of the 7 ranch hands currently employed at the Hayes operation, Roy Finch, who was 40 and loud about it. The Garza brothers, Miguel and Tomas, who were competent workers and vicious gossips. Young Pete Aldridge, who was 17 and hadn't yet learned to keep his reactions off his face. And Cal Drummond, who was older than anyone wanted to count and had opinions about everything and the sense to share only half of them. The stage door opened. There was a pause. The kind of pause that means something is happening that wasn't planned for. And then Clara Boone stepped down. She didn't ask for a hand. She didn't hesitate. She came down from that coach the way a woman comes down from a porch she's descended 1,000 times, steady and unhurried. And she landed on the Wyoming dirt and stood up straight and looked at them all with a pair of dark brown eyes that were doing a great deal of very efficient observing and very little reacting. Pete Aldridge started laughing first. It wasn't a laugh that needed explaining. It said everything it intended to say about what he saw and what he thought of it, and it was exactly the kind of laugh that is designed not just to express amusement, but to invite others to agree to form a wall of agreement, to make the target of it feel the wall going up around them. Roy Finch joined in within 3 seconds. Miguel Garza looked at his brother, and Tomas looked back, and they both had the decency to look away, but they didn't say anything either. Cal Drummond said nothing, studied the dirt, and subtracted himself from the situation, in the way of a man who has been around long enough to know the difference between a moment he can fix and one he can't. Abe Crowder said very quietly, "Lord have mercy." Daniel Hayes said nothing. He was looking at Clara Boone, and he was aware distantly that the laughter was happening, and he was aware that he should probably do something about it. But what held him in place was the expression on her face, which was not humiliation and not rage, and not the fragile, desperate attempt at dignity that he'd seen on people who were trying to hold themselves together under pressure. Her expression was something else entirely. It was patience. The deep, practiced, load-bearing kind of patience that a person only develops if they have been standing in moments exactly like this one for a long time, and have decided somewhere along the way that other people's noise is not their emergency. She picked up her canvas bag. She looked at him. "I don't talk much, mister," she said, "but I can cook." "That's so," Daniel said. "Yes, sir." Pete Aldridge was still going. Roy Finch had added something. Daniel didn't catch the words but caught the shape of them. The kind of words that are meant to cut sideways, not straight on, and Clara. Boone turned her head and looked at Pete Aldridge with an expression so flat and complete that the boy's laughter actually stuttered, caught, and then died out in a series of diminishing sounds like a motor running out of fuel. Daniel cleared his throat. "You got references, letters in the bag." She didn't move to get it. "I'll need to see it." "You'll need to see it when you're ready to read it," she said. "Right now, I'd like to know where the kitchen is." Abe Crowder made a sound behind Daniel that could have been a cough. Daniel looked at this woman, at her steady hands and her level gaze, and the absolute absence of apology in her posture, and he thought about the letter from the placement office, and the 4 months of chaos, and the 3 housekeepers who had quit, and the fact that he had 7 men to feed in the morning, and nothing fit to eat in a kitchen he was half afraid to walk into anymore. He thought about all of that in approximately 4 seconds, and then he made a decision he would spend the next 6 months understanding. "Kitchen's in the house," he said. "Abe'll show you." He turned and walked toward the barn because he needed to think, and thinking was easier when he was moving. Behind him, he heard Abe say, "Right this way, miss." And then he heard nothing else, because he was already through the barn door and out of range, and he told himself he'd read the references letter that evening, and he told himself he'd give it a week, and he told himself firmly, the way you tell yourself things, you don't entirely believe that it didn't matter who she was as long as she could keep that kitchen from constituting a public health emergency. He was wrong about what mattered. He wouldn't figure that out for a while yet. Abe Crowder opened the kitchen door and stepped back out of the way immediately, because he had learned from experience that it was better to let a person react to the kitchen without anyone standing too close. Clara Boone stepped into the doorway and was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was bad. There was no softening that. 4 months of 7 men cycling through a space with no fixed responsibility and no particular interest in cleanliness had left it in a condition that would have discouraged most people. Dishes stacked in arrangements that defied physics. A cast-iron skillet on the stove that had developed what appeared to be its own ecosystem. Flour that had been spilled at some point and then walked through so many times it had become architectural. The smell was complex. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at all of it and was quiet for a long 10 seconds. Then she said, "Is there clean water?" Abe blinked. "Pumps out back." "Soap?" "Should be some in the—" "Find it," she said. "And I need a bucket. 2 if you got them." She walked in and set her bag on the one clear corner of the table. "What time do the men expect supper?" 6 o'clock usually, though lately it's been more of a— 6 o'clock, she said. "I'll have it ready." Abe looked at the kitchen. He looked at her. He looked at the clock on the wall, which said 3:30. "Miss, I don't know if that's—" "2 buckets, she said. "Please." Abe went and got the buckets. He would tell Daniel later that he'd stood outside that kitchen door for 20 minutes after delivering the supplies. Not because he was worried about her, but because he was curious, and what he heard was the sound of systematic, unhurried, absolutely relentless work. Things being moved, things being sorted, water being applied, and periodically, when something required two hands and significant force, a single low word in a voice too quiet to make out. But with an intonation he recognized as the sound of a person who is solving a problem and not asking for help with it. At 6 o'clock, the ranch hands filed into the kitchen and sat down. The table was clear. The smell was gone. There were plates, actual clean plates, set out in a row, and on the stove was a pot of beef stew that smelled like something a person's grandmother might have made, if that grandmother had been both skilled and serious about the enterprise, and a pan of cornbread that was still hot enough to be sending up wisps of steam, and a pitcher of water with a cloth over the top to keep out the dust. Nobody said anything for a moment. Roy Finch said, "Huh." Pete Aldridge sat down and pulled a plate toward him, and then stopped and looked at the stew like he wasn't entirely sure he trusted it. Miguel Garza sat down and served himself without ceremony, and put a piece of cornbread on his plate, and ate it in 2 bites, and then sat still for a second, with an expression that was difficult to read, but that Tomas, his brother, apparently read without trouble, because Tomas immediately served himself a second piece of cornbread before anyone else could reach for it. Cal Drummond sat down at the far end of the table and served himself, and ate slowly and deliberately, and did not look up from his plate. And when he was finished, he set his fork down and said to no one in particular, "That's decent stew." From Cal Drummond, that was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Clara was washing the prep dishes at the pump out back. She did not come in for the meal. She did not wait for compliments. She did not check to see how it was going. Daniel ate at the end of the table, apart from the others, the way he'd been eating since Margaret died, and he didn't say anything either. He ate the stew and the cornbread and drank the water and looked at the clean table surface, actually clean, actually level, not tilting under a stack of things that had been accumulating since spring, and he felt something. He didn't have a ready name for something between relief and something older and harder to look at directly. After supper, he found the references letter in his jacket pocket, where Abe had put it, and he read it in the lamplight. The Cheyenne Domestic Placement Office certified that Clara Boone, age 26, had provided 3 years of exemplary household management for the Whitmore family of Laramie, Wyoming, and had been released from that position only due to the family's relocation to the eastern states. Further, the letter noted, and this was the part that made Daniel read it a second time, that Miss Boone had, during her time with the Whitmore family, provided informal medical assistance to the household and to several neighboring families, having studied nursing methods under the supervision of Dr. Henry Colton of Laramie, and was regarded by Dr. Colton as possessing considerable practical skill in field medicine and wound care. Daniel set the letter down. He sat with that information for a while, turning it over the way you turn over something you find in the dirt that might be worthless or might be valuable, and you can't quite tell yet which. Then he folded the letter back up, set it on the table, and went to find her. She was in the small room off the kitchen, the housekeeper's room, which had been used for storage for 4 months, and which she had, in the hours since her arrival, excavated to the point where there was now a clear floor and a bed with the mattress uncovered. She was sitting on the edge of that bed, reading a small book by the light of a candle stub, and when he appeared in the doorway, she looked up without alarm, the way a person looks up who was expecting eventually to be interrupted. "Read your letter," he said. Says you've got some medical experience." "Some? What's some?" She considered the word. "Enough to know what I know, and enough to know what I don't." Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "We're 30 miles from the nearest doctor." "I know. Had a man get his hand badly cut last month. Took 2 days to get him to Cheyenne. Nearly lost the hand." "I know," she said. "Your foreman told me." Daniel looked at her. "Abe told you that in the 3 minutes he spent showing you the kitchen. He's a talker," she said with no particular inflection. "I listen." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You noticed anything else today? Walking around the place?" This was a test. He knew it was a test when he asked it, and he wasn't sure what he was testing for exactly, but he watched her face while he waited for the answer. She looked at him steadily. "The water trough by the east pasture is developing rot on the south side. The mare in the third stall is favoring her right foreleg. Not a fresh injury, something chronic she's been compensating for. The roof over the bunkhouse has a soft section above the east window that's going to come in this winter if it isn't reinforced. 2 of the fence posts on the north line are set shallow and will pull free in hard wind. She paused. Your hay storage is a problem. What you've got in that barn won't last the winter if the season runs long. Daniel stared at her. You asked, she said. I did, he said. You want me to stop? No, he said slowly. No, I don't. He pushed off the door frame. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at his hands at the map of work and worry and weather, written into them at all the things he hadn't been able to look at straight on for the better part of a year. Then he looked back into that small room at this woman who had arrived 6 hours ago and already knew more about the state of his ranch than 3 of his hands did. I told myself I'd give you a week, he said. She met his eyes. That's fair. Fair's got nothing to do with it, he said. It's just what I said. He turned to go, then stopped. Breakfast is at 5:30. I know, she said. I heard. He went back to the main house. He sat in the kitchen in his clean kitchen at his cleared table, and he put his face in his hands for a moment, not from despair, but from something adjacent to it, something that sits right next to despair on the map, but points in a different direction. He thought about Margaret, because he always thought about Margaret in the quiet, and he thought about the debt that was building like water behind a dam, and he thought about all the things Clara Boone had seen in one afternoon that he had stopped letting himself see, because seeing them and not being able to fix them was worse than not seeing them at all. Then he thought about what she'd said. This place isn't just messy, it's dying. She hadn't said those words yet. She would say them in 4 days in the cold morning light, standing at the fence line with her arms crossed and her eyes on the north pasture. And when she said them, he would not be offended, and he would not argue, and he would not look away. But that was 4 days from now. Tonight he just sat in the kitchen and listened to the silence of a house that had been for the first time in a very long time fed. Outside, the Wyoming wind came across the flats the way it always did after dark, low and steady and indifferent to everything it passed over. It passed over the hay barn with its dangerous shortage. It passed over the fence posts, set too shallow in the north line. It passed over the bunkhouse with its soft roof section, and the east pasture with its rotting trough, and the third stall where the mare stood quietly favoring her right leg in the dark, all of it waiting. All of it, the way Clara Boone had already described it, with the calm, unhurried precision of a woman who had learned long ago that the first step to fixing anything is being willing to look at it without flinching. She was still awake when the candle burned low, reading her small book with the wind at the window, and she was not thinking about what anyone had said when she stepped off the stagecoach, and she was not thinking about the laughter, and she was not making plans or calculations or rehearsing arguments. She was just present. In the room, in the work, the way she always was, the way she always would be. And in the morning, before the sun was fully up, before the ranch hands were out of their bunks, before Daniel Hayes had finished his first cup of coffee, there was smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and the smell of something good drifting across the cold Wyoming yard. And Abe Crowder, who was always the first one up, stopped in the middle of the yard with his hat in his hand and stood there breathing it in and thought privately that whatever happened next, this was already different from how it had been before. He was right about that. More right than he knew. The second morning was colder than the first, and Clara was in the kitchen before the cold had time to settle into the walls. She had been up since 4. Not because anyone asked her to be, not because there was a rule about it, but because there was work to do, and the work did not care what hour it started. She had gone through the pantry the night before after supper, after Daniel had gone to bed, and the ranch hands had drifted back to the bunkhouse, and she had made a list on the inside cover of her small book. Not a long list, just the facts, the way she always recorded things without decoration or alarm. Flour enough for 10 days if she was careful. Salt in adequate supply. 3 jars of preserved tomatoes that were still good. Coffee that would last the week. Beyond that, the situation required attention. She made a mental note to talk to Daniel about supply runs. She made a second mental note that talking to Daniel required timing because she had spent 1 day in this man's company, and already understood that he was the kind of man who could hear hard information and process it correctly if it came to him straight and without ceremony, but who would shut down entirely if he felt he was being managed. She had known men like that before. She knew how to work around that particular wall without making it worse. By 5 o'clock, she had a pot of oats on the stove, thick and salted with dried apple pieces stirred through and a pan of bacon going alongside. She had also, in the 40 minutes before the stove was hot enough to cook on, cleared the highest shelf in the pantry, the one that hadn't been touched in what appeared to be a very long time based on the evidence, and reorganized it according to a system that would make inventory possible, which it had not previously been. Small work. Invisible work. The kind of work that nobody notices until it's been done for a month, and they realize they've stopped wasting half an hour every morning looking for the salt. Abe Crowder came in at 5:20 and stopped. "Morning," Clara said without turning from the stove. "Morning," Abe said. He stood in the kitchen doorway the same way he'd stood there yesterday evening, with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Then he came in and sat down and poured himself a coffee from the pot she'd left on the side of the stove, and he held it in both hands and was quiet, which she appreciated. After a moment he said, "You sleep some. You don't have to be up at 4 in the morning, you know." 5:30 was what he said. 5:30's when the food needs to be ready, Clara said. "Not when the cooking starts." Abe was quiet again. He drank his coffee. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, and the sound of the bunkhouse stirring was just starting to come across the yard. Boots on floorboards, adore low voices. "You find everything you needed?" Abe asked. "Found what's here. Made a list of what isn't." She lifted the bacon pan, tilted it, set it back. "Who does the supply runs?" "Roy Finch usually. Goes into Millard Creek every 2 weeks. Millard Creek have a general store worth the trip. Reasonably. Harmon's on the main street. Fair prices, decent stock. Next run needs to happen this week," she said. "Not in 2 weeks." Abe looked at her sideways. "That's not usually how—" "I know it's not usually how," she said. "But we're short on things that matter, and I'd rather know that now than find out when it's a problem." She set a bowl of oats on the table in front of him without being asked. "You can tell Daniel I said so, or I can. Whichever." Abe looked at the oats. He looked at her. "I'll tell him," he said. "Thank you." The ranch hands filed in at 5:30 on the nose, because the smell of that kitchen had a way of moving through the morning air and communicating urgency more effectively than any foreman's shout. They came in still half asleep and sat down, and Clara served without comment, and the eating began, the serious, concentrated eating of men who had just discovered that breakfast was worth getting up for. Pete Aldridge ate 3 bowls of oats. He did not look at Clara directly, and she did not look at him, and neither of them referenced what had happened in the yard the previous afternoon, because there was nothing to reference. It had happened. It was finished. Clara did not carry things like that around with her. She had learned a long time ago that other people's smallness was not her burden to manage. Daniel came in at 5:45, which she had already calculated was his habit, and he sat at his separate end of the table, and she set a bowl in front of him, and he said, "Thank you," which surprised her slightly, because yesterday he'd said nothing at all. She noted the change the way she noted everything quietly, without making it mean more than it meant. After breakfast, while the ranch hands were dispersing toward their morning work, Daniel stood up and said, "Supply run." Abe said, "Yes, sir." She said, "I heard," Daniel said. "Roy, Millard Creek, today." Roy Finch, who had been about to leave, turned around. "Today?" "That's what I said." Roy looked at Clara, the kind of look that is trying to assign blame for an inconvenience. Clara was washing the pot and did not provide him with a reaction to work with. "Fine," Roy said, and left. Daniel didn't say anything to Clara. He picked up his hat, put it on, and walked out. But he'd heard, and he'd acted on it, and that was the thing that mattered. The morning unfolded the way mornings do on a working ranch layered with tasks, none of them glamorous, all of them necessary. Clara worked through the kitchen first. a deep clean of the stove which had required a degree of dedication she would not describe to anyone, a proper scrub of the floor, an inventory of every shelf recorded on paper, so she had something real to work from. Then she moved to the rest of the house. Not because anyone had asked, but because a house in disorder communicates distress to everyone who lives in it. And she had seen enough distressed men in enough distressed houses to understand that the state of the walls and the floors and the surfaces had something to do with the state of the person inside them. She did not think of this as philosophy. She thought of it as practical information. By noon, she had worked her way through the main room and the hallway, and had started on what appeared to be a small study off the east side of the house, which was where she found the ledger. She did not open it. She dusted the cover and set it back exactly where it had been, because that was not her business. But she saw enough of what was on the desk surrounding it. Overdue notices a letter from the Cheyenne Bank, with a tone she recognized, numbers visible on a page that she had not been trying to read, and had read anyway, because her mind processed information automatically and didn't always wait for permission to understand the shape of the situation. The ranch wasn't just dirty, it wasn't just undermanned. It was in financial trouble of the kind that had a deadline attached to it. She went back to the kitchen and made lunch, and she kept that information in a quiet room in her mind, where she kept things she had no immediate use for but would not discard. 4 days into her employment on a Tuesday morning, she walked the north fence line. She had been walking the property in pieces in the margins of time between tasks, learning the geography of the place, the way you have to learn anything you intend to work with seriously. She had a good picture of it now, the lay of the land, the equipment, the animals, the points of failure that she'd listed on her first night, and that she was adding to as she went. She found Daniel at the north fence, looking at the same 2 shallow posts she'd identified on arrival day. He was standing with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low, and the expression of a man who is looking at a problem he's been looking at for too long without looking directly at it. She came and stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment, both looking at the posts. "You know about these," she said. "Known about them a while. They'll pull in a hard wind." "Yep. Could reset them this week. Ground's still workable." Daniel took a breath. "There's a list of things that need doing on this ranch that's longer than both our arms, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed it without marking it. "I know," she said. "I've been writing it down." He turned and looked at her, and she met his eyes directly and held them. And after a moment he said with the flatness of a man who already knows the answer, but needs to hear it said, "How bad is it?" She considered how to answer that. Not how to soften it. She did not soften things, but how to say it in a way that would be useful rather than simply devastating. "This place isn't struggling," she said. "It's dying. Slow, but dying." She let that sit for a second. The good news is that slow means there's still time to change the direction. Daniel took his hat off. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, the gesture of a man preventing himself from saying something he'd regret. Then he put the hat back on and looked out across the north pasture. "Margaret handled most of the management," he said. "When she was alive. I handled the land and the animals, and she handled everything else. And when she was gone..." He stopped. "I didn't know how to do both, so I did neither right." Clara didn't say anything to that. She had learned that some things a person says are not invitations to respond. They are just true things being said out loud for the first time, and the most useful thing you can do with them is let them have the air. "Water trough by the east pasture," she said after a moment. "If we replace the south side panel this week, the rest of it holds another 2 seasons. If we don't, we lose the whole trough before spring." Daniel was quiet. "I can do it," she said. "I just need the lumber and someone to hold the far side." He looked at her, then really looked at her with something working in his face that wasn't quite skepticism, but was related to it. The reasonable caution of a man who has not yet calibrated what she is capable of and is trying to do so in real time. "You know how to do trough repair," he said. "I know how to do a good many things," she said without pride and without apology. "You hired me to keep your house. I'm telling you, the house isn't the only thing that needs keeping." A long pause. "Abe will go with you," Daniel said. "For the far side." "All right." "Clara." She had already turned to go. She stopped. He was still looking out at the north pasture, and his voice when he spoke next was lower, quieter, stripped of the management layer. "Why?" She turned back. "Sir, why does it matter to you the trough, the fence posts, any of it? You were hired to cook and clean. You could do that and nothing else, and it would still be more than the last 3 people managed." He finally looked at her. "So why?" She thought about the honest answer. She gave it. "Because I can see what's wrong," she said. "And when you can see what's wrong and you have the means to fix it, not fixing it is a choice, and I don't make that choice." He held her gaze for a long moment. The wind came across the flats and moved between them. "All right," he said, and turned back to the fence. She walked back toward the house, and she did not smile, but something in her settled the way a tool settles when you find the right grip on it, not different than it was before, just better positioned. The trough got fixed that Thursday. The fence posts on the north line got reset that Friday. The hay storage problem she addressed in a conversation with Abe that led to a conversation with Daniel that led to an arrangement with a neighboring operation in Millard Creek, who had surplus for a price that wouldn't cripple the budget if they were careful about it. Small things. Practical things. The kind of things that don't look like saving anything until you've gotten far enough back to see the shape of what would have happened without them. It was 2 weeks into her employment that the thing in town happened. She had gone in with Roy Finch on the supply run her first trip into Millard Creek, partly because she needed to see the general store herself to know what they were working with, and partly because there were a few items on her list that required her to make the selections in person. Roy drove the wagon and communicated his opinion of the arrangement through silence and the set of his shoulders, and Clara sat beside him with her list and her canvas bag and watched the landscape come toward them and said nothing, because she did not require conversation to feel at ease. Millard Creek was a working town. Not prosperous, not struggling, settled in the way of a place that had decided what it was and had been that thing for long enough that the edges of it were fixed. A main street with the usual composition, a church at the north end, Harmon's General on the south side of the street, with a false front that was beginning to warp at the upper left corner. Clara noticed the warp. She noticed most things. She was inside Harmon's working through the second half of her list when she heard the sound from the street. It was not a dramatic sound. That was the thing about real emergencies. The sounds they made were not dramatic. They were wrong, specifically, and distinctly wrong in a way that cut through ambient noise and registered in the part of the brain that handles threat assessment before the conscious mind catches up. The sound she heard was a man's voice, but not right, and then a thud, and then nothing. She was outside before she had made a decision to go outside. The man was on the ground in front of the farrier's shop across the street. A woman was kneeling beside him, screaming his name, and 2 men were standing back with the particular helplessness of people who can see. Something is very wrong and have no information about what to do with that. A small crowd was forming with the speed that small crowds form in small towns, which is very quickly. Clara crossed the street, set her canvas bag on the ground, and knelt beside the man. He was perhaps 50, heavyset, with the gray complexion and the shallow, irregular breathing that she recognized immediately, and that told her 3 things at once, 2 of which she could act on, and 1 of which was simply true and had to be accepted. "How long has he been down?" she said to the woman kneeling across from her. "Just now, just this second we were just, has he complained of chest pain today? This morning?" The woman stared at her. "Who are you? Has he complained of chest pain?" Yes, this morning he said his arm hurt, I thought." "His left arm?" "Yes." Clara opened her bag. She had a small kit inside, not large, not complete. Nothing like what a proper physician would carry, but built carefully over years from the intersection of what she knew how to use and what she could reasonably get her hands on. She knew what this was. She had seen it before once in Laramie years before, that when she was 15 and her father had gone the same way on the kitchen floor. and she had not been able to help her father because she had not known then what she knew now. "Give him air," she said to the two standing men, and her voice had a quality in it that moved people without requiring them to think about whether to comply. They stepped back. The small crowd stepped back. "Get him flat. Ma'am, I need you to talk to him. Say his name. Steady voice. Keep saying it." The woman said his name. Thomas, 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 a rhythm like a prayer. Clara worked. She did not explain what she was doing, or narrate it, or reassure anyone watching. She worked the way she worked everything, with the whole of her attention and none of her energy spent on performance. She knew what she could do and what she couldn't, and she did everything she could with the specific and calibrated urgency of someone who understands that panic is not faster than precision, it only feels that way. 18 minutes later, Thomas Greer, which was the man's name, was breathing with more regularity, and the gray in his face had retreated to something closer to its natural color, and his wife was holding his hand with both of hers and crying with the specific relief of someone who had been standing at the edge of an abyss and has stepped back from it. Clara stood up. She closed her bag. The street around her was very quiet. She became aware gradually of how many people were standing there. More than had been there when she started. Word had moved through the town the way word does, and people had come to see, and what they had seen was what they had seen. She saw their faces, the shopkeeper from Harmon's, who had followed her out, and the women from the dressmakers 2 doors down, and a group of men from the direction of the livery, and children who had no business being there, but were there anyway, the way children are, all of them looking at her with an expression she recognized, because she had spent her adult life working to be worth the having of it, and had only sometimes received it. It was the expression of people who were revising something. Roy Finch was beside the wagon with his arms crossed and his mouth pressed shut in the way of a man who has seen something that has reorganized his interior landscape and has not yet decided what to do with the new arrangement. Clara picked up her canvas bag. "I still need 6 pounds of flour," she said to no one in particular, and walked back into Harmon's General to finish her list. Roy Finch did not say a word on the drive back to the ranch. That alone told Clara something, because Roy Finch had opinions about most things, and a consistent willingness to share them in the direction of anyone within earshot. The silence he maintained for 30 miles of Wyoming road was not the comfortable silence of a man at ease. It was the silence of a man doing interior work he hadn't expected to need doing. Clara sat beside him, with her supply list folded in her coat pocket, and watched the land come past and let him have his quiet. She had learned early that silence was not something that needed to be filled just because someone nearby was uncomfortable with it. They got back to the ranch at 4:30. Roy pulled the wagon up to the supply house and climbed down without looking at her, and she climbed down without looking at him, and they unloaded the supplies in the practical wordlessness of 2 people with a shared task and no particular need to discuss it. When the last crate was in, Roy picked up the empty wagon bed cover, folded it, set it on the shelf, and then stood there for a moment with his back to her. "That man," he said. "Thomas Greer." "Yes." "You knew what was wrong with him right off." "Yes." Roy turned around. He had a face that had been weathered into a fairly consistent set of expressions, and the one he was wearing now was one she hadn't seen from him before, not warm exactly, but stripped of the layer of performance that men like Roy Finch kept running at all times, to cover the fact that they were thinking more carefully than they let on. "He'd have died," Roy said. "Not a question." "I don't know that for certain," Clara said. "But his chances without intervention were not good." Roy nodded once the way you nod when someone says something that confirms what you already know and you needed the confirmation anyway. He picked up his hat, which he'd set on the shelf, and put it back on. "I'll get these horses put up," he said, and led the team toward the barn, and that was the end of it. But it was not the end of it. Daniel was at the kitchen table when she came in to start supper. He had the ledger in front of him, which was unusual. She had seen him avoid that ledger with the practiced skill of a man who has decided the information inside it is better left undisturbed. He looked up when she came in. "Heard something," he said. "Roy talk fast for a quiet man," she said, setting her bag on the counter and going to the stove. "Wasn't Roy. Mrs. Aldridge rode out from town. Apparently half of Millard Creek wants to know who you are." Clara kept her back to him and assessed the fire. "I'd think they'd have more to occupy them." "Thomas Greer is a well-regarded man in that town," Daniel said. "His wife went to 3 separate households before dark to tell people what happened. By tomorrow, it'll be at 10. He paused. "Clara." She turned. He was looking at her with that direct, undecorated look. He had the one that didn't ask for more than it was asking for, but asked for what it asked for completely. "Why didn't you tell me about the medical training?" "The letter told you." "The letter said some experience. What you did today isn't some experience." She held his gaze. "Dr. Colton didn't give me a certificate," she said. "I learned from watching and doing and reading everything he'd let me read for 3 years. What I know, I know. What I don't know, I don't attempt." She turned back to the stove. "I told you on the first night enough to know what I know and enough to know what I don't." The silence behind her had a different quality than Roy's silence or Abe's silence or any of the silences she'd navigated in the past 2 weeks. It was a thinking silence, a reassessing silence. "There's no doctor within 30 miles, Daniel said. "You said that before." "I'm saying it again because it means something different now than it did when I said it the first time." She began cutting the salt pork. Outside, the evening wind had picked up and was moving across the yard with the particular persistence it had when the temperature was dropping. She thought about what he was really asking, which was not the thing he was saying in words, and she thought about whether she was prepared to say yes to the thing underneath the words, and she decided that the answer to that had been decided before she ever stepped off the stagecoach, back when she understood what kind of place she was going to and made the choice to go anyway. "I'll help who I can help," she said. "When I can help them. That's all I can promise." "That's enough," Daniel said, and closed the ledger, and that was that. What neither of them could have known sitting in that kitchen with the salt pork going in the pan and the wind at the windows was that the conversation they'd just had was being heard by forces larger than either of them. Not literally, not in the way of spies or eavesdroppers, but in the way that any shift in the order of things sends ripples out in directions you can't track from where you're standing. Victor Hale heard about Thomas Greer inside of 48 hours. Victor Hale heard about most things in Millard Creek inside of 48 hours, because Victor Hale had made it his business for 20 years to be the kind of man that information moved toward. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, 3 times the size of the Hayes Ranch, with grazing rights on land that abutted Daniel's north pasture and that he had been working to absorb into his own holdings for the better part of 3 years. He was not a dramatic man. He did not threaten or bluster or conduct himself in ways that drew attention. He simply applied pressure consistently from multiple directions with the patience of someone who understands that most things fall eventually if you keep pushing in the right place. He'd been pushing on the Hayes Ranch for a year. The debt was his doing, at least in part, not directly, not in any way that could be proven, but through the kind of careful arrangement of circumstances that a man with influence and patience and a good lawyer could construct without leaving fingerprints. A supplier arrangement that fell through at a critical moment. A favorable grazing deal that got quietly redirected. Small things, accumulating things. He'd expected the ranch to fold by winter, and then a woman stepped off the Friday stage. Clara Boone's name reached Victor Hale through his ranch foreman, who had it from a man in Millard Creek, who had it from the woman who'd been 3 households about Thomas Greer. Victor sat with it for a day, and then he sent a man to ask some quiet questions, and then he sat with the answers for another day. And what he understood by the end of that process was that the situation at the Hayes Ranch had changed in a way that required his attention. A housekeeper he could ignore, a housekeeper who fixed water troughs and reset fence posts, and managed supply inventory, and saved a man's life in the middle of the main street of Millard Creek, was a different category of problem. He began with the rumors, because that was always where you began with a woman. It was the easiest place to push, and it cost almost nothing, and the damage it did was difficult to reverse because it moved through social channels that had no accountability and no record. The first thing people started saying in the second week of November was that she wasn't really trained, that she'd gotten lucky with Greer, that anyone with basic sense could have done what she did, that the whole story had been exaggerated in the retelling the way small-town stories always were. The second thing people started saying, and this one was more carefully constructed because it carried the kind of specific detail that gives a lie. The texture of fact was that she'd been dismissed from her last position under unclear circumstances, that the Whitmore family had not in fact relocated east entirely voluntarily, that there had been a situation. Nobody could say what the situation was because there was no situation, but the word situation was doing the work, regardless. It always did. Clara heard the rumors the way she heard most things that moved through Millard Creek through Abe Crowder, who heard them from the men who heard them on supply runs. Abe brought her the information the way he brought her everything directly, and without editorial comment, because he was that kind of man. "Thought you should know," he said, "what people are saying." "I appreciate it," Clara said. She was at the kitchen table with a bowl of dried herbs she'd been sorting. She kept sorting. Abe watched her for a moment. "Doesn't seem to bother you much." "It bothers me some," she said. "I'm just not sure what the useful response to it is yet." "Daniel knows," Abe said. "He's angry." That was new information. She set down the herbs she was holding. "What kind of angry?" "The quiet kind, which is the kind you want to worry about with him." She thought about Daniel Hayes and the quiet anger and what it might move him to do. And she thought about whether that was going to be useful or whether it was going to make things harder, and she arrived at the conclusion that she needed to talk to him before he did anything irreversible. She found him in the barn. He was working on a harness with the particular focused intensity of a man directing a difficult emotion into a task. "Abe told me," she said. "Abe tells you everything." Daniel said without looking up. "He's practical about information, so am I." She came and leaned against the stall beside him. "What are you thinking about doing?" He kept working the harness. "Thinking about going into town and having a conversation with a few people about where stories come from." "That'll make it worse." "I know that." "Then why are you thinking about it?" He finally looked up, and there was something raw in his face, not just anger, but the particular frustration of a man who can see an injustice happening and has no clean tool for addressing it. "Because someone is doing this on purpose, Clara. This isn't gossip. This is a campaign. Somebody wants you discredited, and they want it fast, which means somebody's worried about what you mean for this ranch." She had known that since the second rumor. She had known the shape of it, the direction the pressure was coming from, and what it was designed to accomplish since she'd heard the specific detail about the Whitmore family, because specific false details have a point of origin, and she had a good mind for following lines back to their source. But she had not said this to Daniel yet, because she had not had enough information to say it with the certainty it required. "Victor Hale," she said. Daniel went very still. "I'm not certain," she said, "but I'm close to it." "What do you know about Hale?" "I know what's visible if you know where to look." She kept her voice even. "I know his north grazing rights make your land valuable to him. I know 3 of the things that went wrong on this ranch in the past year and a half have a pattern to them that's hard to explain as pure bad luck. And I know that the rumors started moving exactly 10 days after Thomas Greer, which is long enough to get organized and short enough that the Greer event is still the thing driving them." She paused. "He's not trying to ruin me. He's trying to use me as a reason to ruin you." Daniel set the harness down very carefully, the way you set something down when you are controlling the impulse to throw it. "How long have you known about the debt?" he said. "Since the second day." "The ledger." "I wasn't reading it. I saw it." He was quiet for a long moment, and she let him be quiet and watched his profile in the barn's low light, the jaw, the work in it, the thing he was deciding. "I can't fight Hale," he said. "Not straight on. He's got money and lawyers, and I've got a ranch that's 3 months from foreclosure if we don't turn something around." "I know. So what do you suggest?" She had been thinking about this for a week in the quiet room where she kept problems she was working on, and the answer she'd arrived at was not the obvious one. It was not the defensive one, not the one that addressed the rumors directly, not the one that involved lawyers or confrontations or formal complaints. It was the answer that ran underneath all of those, the one that attacked the premise rather than the surface. "I want to start seeing patients," she said. Daniel stared at her. "Not officially. I can't be official. I'm not a licensed physician, and I won't pretend to be. But there are people in this county who haven't seen a doctor in years because 30 miles is too far and the cost is too high. I want to make myself available to those people." She held his gaze. "You can't fight a rumor with an argument. You fight a rumor with a fact that's bigger than it." "And if someone dies," Daniel said. "If someone comes to you that you can't save." It was the real question. The honest one. She respected him for asking it. "Then someone dies who would have died anyway," she said. "And I'll have to carry that. And Hale will use it." She didn't look away. "But if I do nothing, he wins anyway, just slower and quieter, and I'll carry that too." The wind moved through the barn. Somewhere in the dark of the stalls, one of the horses shifted, blew out a breath. "Use the room off the back of the house," Daniel said. "The one with the east window. It gets good light." He picked the harness up again. "I'll tell Abe to put the word out quiet. Nothing formal. Just that people who need help know where to come." She stood up straight. "Daniel." He looked at her. "I won't let this ranch fall. I told you I don't make the choice not to fix what I can see. That applies to everything here. Not just the fence posts." Something moved across his face that was not quite the expression of a man being offered reassurance, because he was not a man who needed reassurance. It was something else, the expression of a man recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that he was not alone in the room with this problem. That someone else had their hands on the same weight he'd been carrying, and was not asking him to put it down, but was simply lifting it alongside him. He nodded once. She walked back to the house. The first patient came 3 days later. A farm woman from 6 miles east, her youngest child burning with a fever that had been climbing for 2 days and not breaking. She came to the back door at dusk, with the child in her arms, and a face that had gotten past the point of fear into the particular gray exhaustion that lives on the other side of it. Clara brought them inside into the east room with its good window, and she got to work. She did not think about Victor Hale. She did not think about the rumors or the debt or the north fence posts or the hay shortage or any of the accumulating weight of everything she was trying to hold together. She thought about the child's fever and what she knew about it and what the next hour required, and she brought all of herself to bear on the one thing in front of her that could actually be changed. That was how it started. And Victor Hale, who had been watching the Hayes Ranch from a distance with the patience of a man who believed he had already won, had not yet understood that the woman he'd been trying to discredit had just opened a door that was going to be very difficult to close. The child's name was Eli Marsh, and he was 4 years old, and his fever broke at 2 in the morning. Clara knew the exact moment it happened, because she had been sitting beside him since dusk with a damp cloth and a bowl of water she'd been refreshing every 20 minutes. And she felt the change in him. The way you feel. Weather shifting, not all at once, but in degrees. The heat in his small forehead giving way by increments, until it was something closer to warm than burning, and his breathing, which had been shallow and fast, settled into the longer rhythm of real sleep. His mother, whose name was Ruth Marsh, had been sitting in the chair across the room with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the boy with the total unblinking attention of a woman who has decided that if she watches closely enough, nothing can go wrong. When the breathing changed, she looked at Clara. Clara nodded once. Ruth Marsh put her face in her hands and wept with the full force of everything she'd been holding back since she walked through the door 6 hours earlier, and Clara let her weep and kept her own hands busy with the bowl and the cloth, because the weeping was Ruth's, and it didn't need managing. It needed space. In the morning, Ruth Marsh went home with her son asleep against her shoulder and a small packet of willow bark powder with written instructions Clara had produced in the careful, precise handwriting she used for medical notes. She did not ask for payment. Ruth had not offered any because it was plain she did not have it, and Clara had no interest in the subject. What Ruth Marsh did instead was talk. She talked to her neighbor, and her neighbor talked to the woman at the dry goods exchange in Millard Creek, and that woman talked to 4 others, and the particular speed with which this information traveled was partly a function of the size of the community, and partly a function of the fact that it was the kind of information that people in hard circumstances hold on to with both hands, because it is the kind of information that means the difference between manageable and not. There is a woman at the Hayes Ranch. She knows medicine. She will help you. By the end of November, Clara had seen 11 patients. A man with an infected hand wound that had been left too long and required cleaning and drainage and strict instructions that he followed to his credit without argument. A woman in her 60s with a respiratory ailment that Clara could not cure but could manage, giving her something to ease the nights and clear guidelines about what to watch for and when to send for her. 2 children with the same seasonal fever that had taken Eli Marsh dispatched with the same treatment. A rancher's wife who had been carrying a difficult pregnancy and needed someone to tell her plainly what she was facing and what to do about it, which Clara did, and the woman cried, and Clara talked her through what the crying was about and what it wasn't, and when the woman left, she was still frightened, but she was no longer alone in the fright. Daniel watched all of this from the edges of it, not interfering, not commenting, but present in the way of a man who is tracking something important and doing his tracking quietly. He came to her one evening after the 11th patient had gone while she was cleaning the east room and leaned in the doorway in the position she had come to recognize as his thinking position. 11 people, he said. 12 if you count Greer. You're keeping count. I keep records, she said. Dates, names, conditions, treatments, outcomes, everything. She folded the cloth she'd been using and set it on the shelf. If something ever goes wrong, I want the record to show exactly what was done and why. He was quiet for a moment. You're expecting something to go wrong. I'm a practical woman, she said. Something always goes wrong eventually. The question is what kind and how ready you are for it. She did not know when she said that how soon the answer would come. The pressure from Victor Hale arrived in layers, the way all serious pressure does when it comes from someone who is patient and has resources. The first layer had been the rumors, which had been partially neutralized by the accumulated weight of 12 people who could testify from personal experience to exactly what Clara Boone was and was not. The second layer came in early December through a man named Gerald Sloan. Gerald Sloan was Millard Creek's acting justice of the peace, and he was also, though this was not printed anywhere, the beneficiary of a long-standing arrangement with Victor Hale that involved certain favorable rulings on grazing disputes and certain quiet understandings about the direction of county business. He was not a bad man in the way that men who make choices from pure malice are bad. He was a small man, small in the way that people who have allowed their judgment to be purchased stay small the way a stunted tree stays stunted. And he arrived at the Hayes Ranch on a Wednesday morning in December with his hat in his hands and an official document that he was visibly uncomfortable delivering. Clara was the one who opened the door. Sloan looked at her with the expression of a man who has prepared for a version of this encounter that does not match what he is now facing, which was a large, very still woman with dark eyes that were doing the thing they always did, which was seeing him more completely than was comfortable. "Miss Boone," he said. "Mr. Sloan," she said. She had not met him, but she knew who he was, because she knew most things about Millard Creek by this point. There's a matter I need to address with you. Official matter." He looked past her into the house. "Is Mr. Hayes available?" "He's on the north pasture," she said. "You can address the official matter with me." Sloan unfolded the document. His hands were not entirely steady. "It's come to the attention of the county that you've been providing what amounts to medical services to residents of this area, without a license or certification of any kind. There are concerns have been raised about—" "Who raised them?" Clara said. "I'm not at liberty to." "I know who raised them," she said. "Tell me what the document says." Sloan read the relevant section. It said in the formal language of official documents that one Clara Boone was hereby directed to cease and desist from the practice of medicine in the county, pending review of her qualifications, and that any continuation of said practice would result in formal charges and potential removal. Clara listened to all of it without changing her expression. When he was done, she said, "Leave it on the table." He did. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hands at her sides, and the document on the table, and the sound of the wind at the windows, and she thought about what she was feeling, which was not fear and not despair, but something hot and controlled and deeply familiar. The feeling of a wall being built around her by people who were afraid of what she represented, and the equally familiar feeling of having to decide what to do about it. She sent Abe for Daniel. Daniel read the document once, set it down, and looked at her with an expression that had moved past anger into a colder place. "He can't enforce this," he said. "Not legitimately. A justice of the peace doesn't have the authority to practice restrict a—" "He has enough authority to make it difficult," Clara said. "And difficult is all Hale needs right now. He doesn't need to win the legal argument. He needs to make the situation expensive and complicated enough that we back down. We're not backing down. I know that. So I need to write a letter," she said, "to Dr. Henry Colton in Laramie. I need his written testimony about my training and his professional endorsement of my capabilities. That won't make the document disappear, but it changes the weight of it considerably." She paused. "And I need to write a second letter, to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, about the grazing arrangement between Hale and the county." Daniel looked at her. "You have information about that. I have observations," she said carefully, "about a pattern of things that happened to this ranch over the past year and a half. I've been documenting them since the second week. I don't have proof of anything improper, not yet, but I have enough to ask questions, and sometimes the right questions asked in the right direction are sufficient to move something that looked immovable." The silence stretched between them. Outside, she could hear Cal Drummond crossing the yard, his slow, deliberate boots on the frozen ground. "Clara," Daniel said, "how long have you been doing this?" She understood what he was asking. Not how long had she been writing the letters, but how long had she been building the case? How long had she been thinking several moves ahead of where they were standing? "Since the third week," she said. "When I understood what this was." He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands. "You should have told me." "You had enough on your mind," she said. "And I wasn't sure yet. I don't bring people incomplete information." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not working for me," he said slowly. "You're working with me." She met his eyes. "I've been working with you since the day I got here," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." Something shifted in his face. Not the dramatic collapse of a wall, but the quieter thing. The easing of something that had been held rigid for a long time. The kind of shift you only see in a person when they are perhaps for the first time in a longer while than they'd like to admit genuinely not alone. He put his hat on. "Write the letters," he said. "I'll get them to the stage." She wrote them that evening after supper at the kitchen table. The letter to Dr. Colton was professional and precise, laying out the situation, without dramatic emphasis, requesting his formal written endorsement for delivery to the Millard Creek Justice of the Peace. The letter to the Federal Land Office was measured and careful, framed as an inquiry, rather than an accusation, asking about the procedures by which grazing rights were awarded and transferred in the county, and requesting information about any arrangements currently in effect between private landowners and county officials. She sealed both letters and set them on the table for morning. She was back at the kitchen table at 4 the next morning when the knock came at the back door. It was not a knock that announced itself comfortably. It was the knock of someone who has come a long way in the dark and is not sure they're at the right place and is frightened enough that the uncertainty doesn't matter anymore. Clara opened the door. The man standing there was perhaps 35, though hard living had added years to his face. He was holding himself with one arm across his midsection and the other braced against the doorframe, and the color of his face was the color she associated with a particular category of emergency. Behind him in the yard was a horse that had been ridden hard. "Someone told me," he said, and his voice was labored. Someone told me, the woman here, that she could help. Come inside, Clara said, and took his weight. His name was Frank Delacroix, and he had been kicked by a horse 3 days prior, and had been telling himself for those 3 days that it would get better on its own, because that was what men told themselves when the alternative was admitting the seriousness of the thing, and there was no help within reach. It had not gotten better. It had gotten considerably worse. Clara put him on the table in the east room and got her kit and the lamp and began her assessment, and what she found when she found it made her go very still for a moment. In the way she went still, when she was calculating what she knew, what she didn't know, what the timeline was, what the tools available to her were. "Frank," she said, "I'm going to be honest with you." "All right," he said. His voice was steady in the way of a man conserving what he has left. "You have internal damage from that kick. I can see the bruising, and I can feel the rigidity, and I know what it means." She kept her hands moving while she talked, not stopping the work to deliver the information. "I can do some things for you here tonight that will help, but you need a physician. A real one, not me. Nearest one's 30 miles. I know. We're going to get you 30 miles. She raised her voice toward the hallway. Abe appeared in the doorway because Abe had heard the knock and had the sense to be nearby. "Yes, ma'am. I need the fastest horse we have, and Daniel up now. We're taking this man to Cheyenne." She looked back at Frank Delacroix. "Are you still with me?" "Still here," he said. "Good, stay there." She did everything she could do in the 40 minutes before the horse was ready. She packed the wound carefully, gave him what she had for the pain, which was not enough but was something, and she talked to him steadily the entire time. Not false comfort, not promises she couldn't keep, but the real thing, the presence of a person who is paying complete attention to you and treating you like someone worth the full weight of that attention. Daniel drove. Clara rode in the back with Frank Delacroix for 30 miles through the black pre-dawn cold, her hands keeping pressure and her voice keeping him conscious and anchored. They reached the physician in Cheyenne at dawn. Frank Delacroix lived. It was a near thing, and the physician said so plainly, and the margin between the outcome they got and a different outcome was, the physician further said, significantly affected by the care he had received before arrival. He said this to Daniel in the hallway outside the examination room, and Daniel looked at Clara when he heard it. She was sitting on a bench at the end of the hallway, with her kit on her knees, and the exhaustion of the night written into every line of her. And she was not looking at anything in particular, just resting in the way a person rests when they have spent everything they have and need a moment before they decide what to do next. Daniel sat down beside her. They were quiet for a while. The physician's office had the sounds of morning coming into it through the windows, the town waking up, the particular noise of Cheyenne beginning its day indifferent to and unaware of what had just been determined in its vicinity. "He's going to be all right," Daniel said. "I know," Clara said. "The physician's good. You got him here. We got him here." Another silence. And then Daniel said in a voice that was not his management voice or his rancher voice, but something beneath those, something that had not been said to anyone in a long time. "I haven't been in Cheyenne since Margaret. We brought her here at the end. Tried to—" He stopped. He pressed his hands on his knees. "Tried to find someone who could do something." Clara sat with that. She did not offer anything to it, not consolation, not deflection, not the reflexive kindness that fills silences because silence is uncomfortable. She just let it be true beside her, the way she let most true things be. "She would have liked you," Daniel said finally. "Margaret. She had no patience for people who made themselves smaller than they were." He looked at his hands. "She'd have had a thing or two to say about the way this county's been treating you." Clara looked at the far wall. Something in her chest moved careful and private in response to those words. Not the response of a woman being told she is liked or approved of. The response of a woman who has been seen accurately, completely, without reduction or addition, by someone whose seeing she has come to consider worth having. "Your wife sounds like a woman worth knowing," she said. "She was," he said. "She was exactly that." They drove back to the ranch in the early afternoon, and the letters were still on the kitchen table where she'd left them, and she gave them to Abe for the next stage. Victor Hale received his answer about the direction of things 3 weeks later, when a federal land office representative arrived in Millard Creek to conduct what he described as a routine inquiry into grazing rights assignments in the county. The representative was polite and thorough, and asked questions of Gerald Sloan that Sloan had not been prepared to be asked, and the answers to those questions led to other questions, and the process of that inquiry had a weight and a direction to it that was going to take months to resolve, but that announced clearly, and without drama, that the assumptions Hale had been operating on were no longer as solid as they'd appeared. Clara heard about it from Abe, who heard it from Roy Finch, who had been in Millard Creek the day the representative arrived and had watched Gerald Sloan's face go a particular color when the questions began. She was at the kitchen table doing accounts when Abe told her, and she set her pencil down and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good," and picked the pencil back up. That evening, Daniel came into the kitchen while she was finishing supper and stood at the stove beside her. Not his usual spot at the table, not his end-of-day management posture, but close the way a person stands close to something they trust to be steady. "The cease and desist," he said. "Sloan hasn't moved on it, hasn't made another mention of it. I noticed. Might be he's got other things on his mind now." "Might be," she said. She stirred the pot without looking at him. "The patients are still coming. 3 more this week." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a room. Behind the east room, the one you've been using. Bigger. Better light in the afternoon. I could have Abe clear it out. Put in a proper table, some shelving." She stopped stirring. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at the pot or the stove or the middle distance somewhere in that direction with the careful non-expression of a man who has said something that means more than the words and is waiting to see how that lands without being willing to stand there and watch it happen. "That would be useful," she said. "All right then," he said. He went to the table and sat down. She turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the pot and the wind outside. And somewhere in the quality of that quiet was something new. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of anything that had been threatening them, but the sense of 2 people who have faced the same direction for long enough that the distance between them has changed into something neither of them has found a word for yet. Victor Hale was not finished. They both knew that. A man like Victor Hale did not pivot from pressure to acceptance because of a federal inquiry and a few letters. He had more moves, and some of them were going to land. But that was tomorrow's wait. Tonight the kitchen was warm and the supper was ready, and Frank Delacroix was alive in a bed in Cheyenne, and the letters had done what letters sometimes do, which is move something in the right direction by asking the right question at the right time. Clara served the supper. Daniel said thank you, which he now did every evening with the particular quiet of a habit that had become genuine. And outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the windows, and the ranch held. The bigger room was ready by the 2nd week of January. Abe and the Garza brothers had cleared it out on a Saturday, carrying years of accumulated ranch storage into the barn with the focused efficiency of men who had been given a clear task and understood its importance without needing it explained. Daniel had come in afterward with lumber and built 2 shelves along the east wall, working with the quiet concentration he brought to physical problems, the kind of work that let a man think without having to account for what he was thinking about. Clara had cleaned the room from floor to ceiling and organized her supplies on those shelves with the same system she used for everything practical, visible, nothing wasted. When it was done, she stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. It was not a hospital. It was not a clinic in any formal sense of the word. It was a room with good light and clean shelves and a solid table and the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had spent years learning to do the most she could with what she had. But it was real, and it was hers, and the fact of it sitting in Daniel Hayes's house with his knowledge and his lumber in its walls meant something that she kept in the quiet room in her mind, where she kept things that were too important to look at directly too often. "It'll do," she said to no one in particular. "High praise," Abe said from behind her, and she heard the smile in it. January moved. The way January moves on the Wyoming plains, slowly with weight, the cold settling into everything and staying there without apology. The patients kept coming, not a flood. Nothing that overwhelmed her capacity, but a steady current of people who had heard through the particular underground of rural community knowledge that there was a woman at the Hayes Ranch who would see you and would tell you the truth and would not make you feel ashamed for needing help. She saw 23 patients in January. She kept the records on every one of them in a cloth-bound ledger she'd purchased from Harmon's General on a supply run, dates, names, presenting conditions, treatments, outcomes, notes on follow-up. Not because anyone required it of her, because precision was how she respected the people in her care, and because she understood with the clear-eyed practicality that had always been her best tool, that documentation was the thing that would protect her if protection became necessary. It became necessary in February. Victor Hale's next move was more direct than the rumors and more elegant than the cease and desist, and it announced itself on a Tuesday morning when a man named Edward Carr rode up to the ranch with a document from the Cheyenne Bank. Clara was in the medical room when he arrived. She heard the voices in the yard, Daniel's tight and controlled, and a stranger's apologetic in the particular professional way of a man who is delivering bad news on behalf of someone else and has decided that tone is the closest thing available to absolution. She came out and stood on the porch. Edward Carr was a bank representative, and the document he carried notified Daniel Hayes that the outstanding balance on the ranch loan, which had been extended twice already, was being called in full. Not renegotiated, not extended again. Called 60 days. Clara looked at the document over Daniel's shoulder. 60 days to produce a sum that the ranch did not have, could not generate in that time frame, and that would result at the end of those 60 days in foreclosure proceedings that would transfer the land to the bank, which would then, in all likelihood, sell it to the highest bidder in the county, a process that required no imagination to see the conclusion of. Daniel's face was stone. Carr left as quickly as was professionally acceptable. Daniel stood in the yard with the document in his hand for a long moment without moving, and Clara stood on the porch and watched him. And she recognized what she was seeing. Not a man breaking, but a man at the exact edge of what he could carry, feeling the weight shift from manageable to something else entirely, and trying to find the footing for it. "Come inside," she said. He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and they looked at each other with the directness that had become the language of their particular working partnership. No softening, no circling, no management of the other person's reaction. 60 days, he said. Yes. I don't have it. I know. Hale knows I don't have it. That's the point. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He's been patient. I'll give him that. He waited until the inquiry settled down to make this move. Waited until it looked like we might actually have turned something around. He looked at the table. Clean timing. Remind everyone that the ground under our feet has a price on it regardless of what else we've built. Clara was quiet for the moment. She had been thinking about this contingency for 3 weeks because she had seen the bank pressure building in the pattern of things and had understood that Hale was not done simply because the federal inquiry had complicated his position. Men like Hale operated on multiple tracks simultaneously. The inquiry had slowed one track. It had not stopped the others. How much, she said, does the community owe this ranch? Daniel looked up. I'm not speaking romantically, she said. I'm speaking practically. In January alone, 23 people came through that back room. Since November, it's been more than 50. People who had no physician, no access to care, who drove or rode or walked, however far they had to, because I was here. She held his gaze. Those people have neighbors. And their neighbors have neighbors. And in a community this size, in a county where people remember who helped them when no one else would, that is a form of currency. Not romantic. Actual. You're talking about asking people for money, Daniel said. I'm talking about telling people the truth, she said. That the ranch that's been helping them is about to be taken away by a man who's been working against this community for 20 years and letting them decide what that's worth to them. She paused. I'm not asking you to beg. I'm asking you to let people who want to stand up have somewhere to stand. He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove ticked. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses made a sound that carried faintly through the cold air. "I've never asked anyone for anything," he said. "I know," she said. "That's been a problem for a while now." Something in his face shifted almost for just a moment, something close to a smile, and then it passed and left behind it a new expression, one she didn't have a ready name for, but that looked under its seriousness like a man deciding to trust something larger than himself. "All right," he said. "How do we do it?" She had the answer already, because she had been building it in her mind for weeks, the way she built everything carefully from the ground up. Nothing decorative, every piece earning its place. "We start with the people I've treated," she said. "Ruth Marsh, the Hendersons, Frank Delacroix, Thomas Greer if he's well enough, and I believe he is. We don't ask them to give what they don't have. We ask them to come to a meeting at this ranch and to bring anyone they know who understands what's at stake." She folded her hands on the table. "We tell the truth about what Hale has done, not as accusation, as documentation. I have records. I have dates. I have a pattern that anyone looking at it plainly can understand. We put that in front of people, and we let them make their own decision. And if they don't come, then we know what we know," she said simply. "But I don't think that's what happens." She was right. The meeting was 3 weeks later on a Saturday in the Hayes barn, because the house was not large enough for what arrived. Clara had not anticipated the numbers she had hoped for, 20 planned for 30, and when the wagons and horses began coming up the ranch road in the February cold, she stood in the barn doorway and counted, and then stopped counting, because the counting was beside the point. They came because Ruth Marsh had talked to her neighbors. They came because Thomas Greer, restored to his full self, had walked the length of Millard Creek's main street and told anyone who stood still long enough to listen exactly what had happened to him on that road in October and what it meant. They came because Frank Delacroix had ridden in from 30 miles away specifically to be in that barn, and because people who heard his voice when he talked about that night made decisions about where they needed to be. Daniel stood at the front of the barn and spoke without notes, which was not his natural condition. He was not a speaker, had never pretended to be, but what he said was plain and true, and carried the specific weight of a man who is not performing honesty, but simply being honest, which is a different thing entirely, and an audience always knows the difference. He told them about the debt and the bank and the 60 days. He told them about the pattern of things over the past 2 years. The supplier that fell through the grazing deal redirected the rumors, the cease and desist, and he named Victor Hale plainly, without theatrical emphasis, because the facts were sufficiently theatrical on their own. Then he stepped back and Clara stepped forward. She had the ledger. She opened it, and she read from it, not all of it, not every entry, but enough. Enough names, enough dates, enough conditions and treatments and outcomes to make the room understand what it had received and what losing this ranch would mean in practical terms for the people who lived within 30 miles of it. She did not speak loudly. She never spoke loudly. But the barn was very quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when what is being said in them is exactly what needs saying, and every word reached the back wall and came back. When she was done, she closed the ledger. "I'm not a physician," she said. "I don't have a certificate or a license or a letter from any institution. What I have is what I know, and what I know I learned so I could use it." She looked at the room at Ruth Marsh in the second row, with her son beside her at the Garza brothers, standing at the side wall at Cal Drummond in the back, with his arms crossed and his old face absolutely still. "I'm not asking you to save this ranch for my sake. I'm asking you to consider what this county looks like without it, what it looked like before November, and whether that's what you want to go back to." The silence held for 3 seconds. Thomas Greer stood up first. He was a large man, and when he stood, the movement had the quality of something significant shifting. He did not make a speech. He said, "I'll put in what I can manage, and I'll be here when it's needed." And then he sat down. Ruth Marsh stood up next. Then the man whose infected hand Clara had treated in November. Then a woman Clara didn't recognize, someone's neighbor, someone who had come because someone else had told them to come, who said simply, "Tell me where to bring it and when." One by one, and then in clusters that overlapped each other, the barn rose. Not all of them had money. Some of them had labor. Some had materials or equipment or skills, or simply the willingness to be present and visible, and to communicate by their presence. That Victor Hale's version of how things worked in this county was not the version they were willing to live with. An older rancher from the south end of the county stood up and said he had a land surveyor nephew in Cheyenne who owed him a favor, and who could with documentation make a case to the bank that the collateral value of the Hayes property had been artificially suppressed, and that the artificial suppression of collateral value in connection with a called loan was something federal banking regulators tended to find interesting. That last piece moved through the room differently than the rest. Clara watched the faces register it, the shift from emotional solidarity to something more structural. The understanding that what was being assembled in this barn was not just community feeling, but actual force. The kind that didn't disperse when the meeting was over. Daniel stood at the side of the barn while all of this happened, and Clara watched him without making it obvious that she was watching, and what she saw on his face was the expression of a man being changed by something not dramatically, not in the movie poster way, but in the way that actual change happens, which is incremental and evidenced by small things: the set of the shoulders, the quality of the eyes, the posture of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just for the first time put some of it down. Victor Hale received word of the meeting within 48 hours. Clara had expected that because nothing of that size happened in a county this small, without reaching the people who tracked such things. She had also expected, and correctly, that his response would be to accelerate rather than retreat, that the meeting would read to him as a provocation, and that a man like Hale did not respond to provocation by reconsidering his position. What she had not fully anticipated was how quickly his acceleration would run into the walls that had been quietly constructed around it. The federal land inquiry had been moving slowly, as federal inquiries do. But the surveyor's nephew from Cheyenne proved to be both competent and motivated, and the documentation he produced regarding the suppressed collateral valuation went directly to the bank's regional officer. Not Millard Creek's branch, but the regional officer in Cheyenne who had oversight responsibilities and a professional interest in not having his institution implicated in arrangements that could draw the kind of attention that made careers difficult. The bank did not cancel the loan call, but it renegotiated the timeline and renegotiated the terms, and the renegotiated terms were ones the Hayes Ranch, with 60 days of focused community effort behind it, could meet. Gerald Sloan quietly withdrew the cease and desist with no formal explanation and no acknowledgement that it had ever existed, which was the kind of institutional self-preservation that Clara recognized and did not particularly resent, because the outcome was the same. Victor Hale did not disappear. He was not arrested, not ruined, not dispatched with the finality of a story that needs a clean ending. He was what he had always been: a powerful man, in a county where power was real and durable, and did not simply dissolve because it had been challenged. But he had been checked. The specific configuration of damage he had been engineering against the Hayes Ranch had been interrupted at enough points that its momentum was broken, and a man who operates through the careful arrangement of circumstances relies on those circumstances remaining arranged, and enough of them had been rearranged by the time March arrived that the architecture of what he'd built no longer held its shape. It was enough. Not everything enough. On an afternoon in early April, Clara was in the medical room when Daniel appeared in the doorway. She was writing up a patient record, and she looked up, and his expression was the expression of a man who has arrived at a moment with something to say and is deciding how to say it. "Bank confirmed this morning," he said. "We're clear." She set her pen down. "The loan terms are manageable," he continued. 3 years to stability if we're careful, and we'll be careful." He came into the room and stood beside the shelf she'd built her supply system on, and he ran a hand along the edge of it, the way a man touches something he's made and means to keep. "I've been thinking about the space behind the barn, the old storage shed. It's sound enough structure. With work, it could be expanded into something real. A proper medical room with a waiting area and a separate entrance so patients don't have to come through the house." Clara looked at him. You can't call it a clinic, he said. Not officially. Not yet. But you can build toward a thing before you name it. He met her eyes. I've also written to the territorial government about licensing provisions for practitioners in underserved rural areas. There's a territory representative in Cheyenne who wrote back already. Says it's a conversation worth having. She was quiet for a moment, looking at this man at the rancher who had almost sent her away on the first day, who had given her 1 week with the resignation of someone expecting to be disappointed, who had sat beside her on a bench in Cheyenne in the early morning and said his wife's name, and told her Margaret would have liked her, who had stood in a barn full of his neighbors and spoken without notes because the truth didn't require them. You've been busy, she said. You've been busy, he said. I've been paying attention. She stood up from the table. She crossed to the shelf and looked at the careful rows of her supplies at the ledger, with its 53 entries at the room that had been built out of cleared storage and plain lumber, and the decision of a man who understood by then that what was happening in this corner of Wyoming was worth building around. You know this will keep bringing trouble, she said. Hale isn't done. The licensing will take years. There'll be more Sloans, more documents, more... I know, he said. And you're all right with that. He looked at her with the steady, undeflecting eyes of a man who has stopped managing his own fear and started simply standing in it. I'm all right with that, he said, because I've noticed that trouble doesn't seem to be your breaking point. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest moved, that careful private thing that had been moving by increments since the day she arrived, the thing she had been keeping in the quiet room where she kept things too important to examine too closely. She let it be what it was. She did not name it yet because some things earn their name slowly, and the naming is not the beginning of them. I'll need more shelving, she said. I figured, he said. Outside, the April light was coming through the east window. The way good light comes without announcement, without drama, simply present and doing its work. The Wyoming land stretched out past the glass in every direction, and the north fence held, and the hay barn was full, and the water trough by the east pasture had stood through the winter without a problem. 53 people had come through that back room and gone home to their lives. 53 people who might not have. Clara Boone, the woman who had stepped off the Friday stage into a yard full of laughter, who had walked into a dying house and decided that dying was not a fixed condition, who had written the letters and kept the records and driven through the pre-dawn cold and stood in that barn and read from her ledger, in a voice that didn't need volume to carry. Clara Boone looked at the shelf she had built her work on and understood with the clear and unadorned certainty that was the signature of everything she knew to be true, that the life she had built here was not the life anyone had expected for her. It was the life she had made, and she had made it the only way she knew how, by showing up every morning and doing the work that was in front of her, and refusing with every quiet and absolute fiber of her being to accept that what was broken could not be fixed. She picked up her pen and opened the ledger to the next clean page. There was always more work to do, and Clara Boone had never once in her life been afraid of that,